station. Any unattended articles are likely to be removed without warning.
This is the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman. The Hour of History Cities podcast, as well as other Hour of History podcasts, can be streamed and downloaded at hourofhistory.com, iTunes, Google Music, our YouTube channel, and TuneIn. Be sure to also check out our Hour of History blog at hourofhistory.com/blog. And now we begin the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman.
Hello, and welcome to Hour of History Cities podcast, World Cup edition. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman, and today I'm going to talk about two new cities that are hosting the Russia World Cup 2018 as we continue to look at the 10 host cities for the upcoming World Cup that kicks off June 14th in Moscow. First, before we get started, I'd like to say a special word of thanks to our producer at Hour of History, James Abel, who's working out on the other side of the country. Hour of History is a production that involves two coasts. It involves work done in the Hour of History studio in Philadelphia, and then on the other side of the United States in Hour of History West Coast headquarters in California. So working together, James is able to take these audio clips, take this information, and he turns it around and makes it available on all the web providers for podcasts as well as major video outlets, even like YouTube. And we're going to continue to improve, and James's technological contribution to Hour of History is just absolutely fantastic and absolutely helpful. With that in mind, it's time to move on to two new cities, and we have some very interesting cities today. As we continue to move away from these major metropolitan mega cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, we continue on to some of the smaller but not less important cities of the Russian Federation. Today I'm going to talk about Kazan and Samara. So Kazan is a city down the river from Moscow. It's not connected by the same river. It has its own river, the Volga River. And it's on the same river, actually, as Samara. So the Volga is a very important river in the history of Russia. Like we've mentioned on other cities, cities tend to build up around rivers. But Kazan and Samara are a little further east. They also tend to have a different, more diverse heritage than some of these other Russian cities we've talked about. So first, I'll start with Samara. So Samara is host to some games at this Russian World Cup. It was a closed city under the Soviet Union. So between 1917 and 1991, not a lot of people were able to go to Samara. So even the fact that you get to go to Samara or get to see Samara is sort of a novel idea. Now, Samara is a relatively large city. It's got over 1 million people. It's not the biggest city. It's not necessarily comparative to, say, Moscow or St. Petersburg, but it is rich with culture, and it has a nice history that makes it an interesting place to visit. Now, Samara has a unique tie to the United States in the fact that after the Russian Revolution, or during the Russian Revolution, after World War I actually, before it became a closed city, before foreigners were totally pushed out, the American Relief Administration Association, the ARA, which was an aid organization started by the Quaker president Herbert Hoover, actually sent aid to this area that had an enormous amount of famine. So this actually intersects with some of the research I do on Quaker aid and famine relief, especially in the early 20th century. So while the Soviets were sort of figuring out who's going to rule each area and who's going to be in charge of these new constituent states, Americans were also giving aid and making outreach. So it's very fascinating. You can go back and read these sort of Quaker documents of interactions with people in these very, at the time, rural Russian areas. And let me tell you, there's an enormous amount of respect in these Philadelphia archives, these documents that you find here that describe the people of Samara. Anyway, after this famine relief, after this sort of attempted outreach to the Soviet Union, it gets closed off. and becomes an important economic city for the Soviet Union. Samara's name, like many of these cities in Russia, is changed during the Soviet Union for a Bolshevik leader, Valerian Kuybyshev. It changes back to its historic name of Samara in 1991. Looking at the coat of arms, like I typically like to do, is a relatively simple but more pleasing coat of arms than that of Sochi that I ripped apart last time. This one just has a white goat on a field of wild grass. Simple. It gets the point aside. So Samara is now an important, significant transportation area. It's a link to sort of more eastern, more away from metropolitan European Russia. The game that is going to be hosted in Samara is going to be hosted at the Cosmos Arena, which is a sort of new building that costs $300 million. It seats 45,000, and it's going to play host to some interesting games. You've got Costa Rica, Serbia, Denmark, Australia, Uruguay, Russia, and Senegal, Colombia. So Russia is going to get to play a home game here. It's also going to play host to the July 2nd round of 16 match and the July 7th quarterfinal match. Now, originally when Russia had put forth this bid for the World Cup, it was going to build Samara a stadium on an island from recovered land. So it was going to be a recovered land island that was, not developed in any way. And that idea was rejected. It was going to cost too much. So the Cosmos Stadium is on the outskirts of the city rather on the Volga River. It would have been really cool. The designs before that Russia submitted in the bid looked just fantastic. But unfortunately, the stadium's going to be on the outside. Still a beautiful stadium, still going to have some fantastic games. So that takes us up the river to our next city, Kazan. Kazan also has just over 1 million people. It has its own Kremlin, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it is a city in the Republic of Tatarstan. So Russia is a federation. It has 22 republics within the federation. It has different administrative units, but this administrative unit is sort of given to the ethnic Tatar people who trace their heritage to the golden hordes of the Mongol times. So Kazan's population is only about half Russian, half trace their ancestry to these Tatar descendants. There's a strong, diverse culture. There's Russian Orthodoxy there. There is Sunni Islam is widely practiced, and it gets an enormous amount of tourists because it's an absolutely beautiful city. Going back to even the word, we don't really know what it means, but people tend to say, okay, it could be the Tatar word Kazan, which means boiler or cauldron, which I think is kind of an interesting name, considering that it is really sort of a mixing space there. So it has a much longer history, going back to these golden hordes, these Mongol invaders. It lasted through the Russian Tsars. It was taken over, massacred by Ivan the Terrible in 1500. So this is one of those sort of medieval Russian cities, more in the vein of Moscow, that has been battled over for centuries. The Russian Empire, it had its own government. It was just an important sort of city that even had a university under this empire that was not known for its sort of public works. And it was basically a mixing pot of this Islamic and Orthodox cultures. Kazan was the center of some serious fighting during the Russian Revolution. There were some dissident anti-Bolshevik groups that put up massive armies to fight the Bolsheviks, so there was a huge fight there. Eventually, it became an important city for the military industry under the Soviet Union. It still, to this day, produces planes and produces tanks. So Kazan is an important city culturally. It's an important city economically. It's important as far as its tourist industry as well. Now, The matches for Kazan are going to be played in Kazan Arena. It's the home of the Russian Premier League Rubin Kazan, who sort of gained fame a couple years ago when they, spent wildly and bought some players and made a run and then lost a lot of their money. Kazan used to be one of those teams that you could just use in FIFA and win. No one would know that you're going to beat Kazan, this Russian team, and then you would have all these fast players. Something I used to do. Anyway, back to the World Cup. The stadium, it has been used for numerous events already. The Russians like to hold events in Kazan because it's a beautiful city. Like I mentioned, it has that tourist infrastructure. It's a hub of transportation. It played host to the 2017 Confederations Cup because it already had the infrastructure for this World Cup matches. So on June 16, France and Australia are going to open the games in Kazan for Group C. Iran and Spain are going to play each other there 4 days later. Poland and Colombia, South Korea and Germany. And it's also going to host a round of 16 and a quarterfinals matchup. Now, Kazan, going back to my little coat of arms movement, Kazan has the coolest coat of arms that I've come across at this point. Why? Because it's simple, it has a cool design, it has something that's relevant to the culture of Kazan, and it has a long history. So on it is a Zealand, or a dragon wyvern, a dragon snake. It's been described as an animal with a head of a dragon, body of a bird, legs of a chicken, the neck and tail of a snake, the ears of a canine, red wings, sharp teeth, and dark gray feathers to match its scaly gray dark skin. And this is a mythological creature that goes back to the sort of Tatar culture. It has the white background and it's just walking along there on green grass. It symbolizes all sorts of things. The purity, the maturity, the energy, the force. This is coming from, the official website of the Tatar, the National Library of the Republic of Tatarstan. And this symbol goes throughout all sorts of various cities that have shared cultural heritage here. Now, there's a myth and legend that any snake that lives past 100 years turns into one of these Zealands. So I don't know. You'll have to tell me if that's the case. Another cool thing about Kazan, and this is going to be my last sort of issue, is this the Church of all faiths that's there, that's been built. These areas are melting pots of different religious traditions, and the idea was that there was going to be a church built for all the worldly traditions. And I'll include a picture on the website, hourofhistory.com. You can see this. This is an active religious building that houses various religions from around the world and is an architectural mishmash as busy as the coat of arms of Sochi. Anyway, Kazan and Samara, two absolutely fascinating cities with diverse populations, important industry, and cities that will certainly steal some of the show there at Russia World Cup 2018. So if your team is lucky enough to have been assigned to one of those cities, to have drawn one of those arenas, it's going to be absolutely fantastic. Thanks again for joining me on Hour of History Cities podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place.